The question of how long people can live in the Star Wars galaxy with all their advanced technology and force powers is one which has kept Palpatine up at night. So today we're going to go through the answers, and yes, that's answers plural. Although actually it's a bit more consistent than you might expect. Well, we're going to be talking primarily about human lifespan, since I assume that's most of who's watching this video and I love pandering. Let's go over some aliens first. Alien lifespans have an incredibly wide range in Star Wars. On the shorter end, you tend to have insectoid species like Geonosians and Rurians, who would probably consider themselves lucky to make it into their 50s or 60s, and there are some with expected lifespans even shorter than that. Once you get into more humanoid species, you tend to have lifespans that match more what we expect of humans in the real world today. But even some more humanoid species, like the Syrians, have a lower lifespan in Legends, where according to the Ultimate Alien Anthology, being 60 plus as a Syrian was considered similar to being 80 or 90 plus as a human. One thing you do need to keep in mind though is that with humans and non-humans, when you're force sensitive, you generally get to live longer than everyone else. That is, if you're not killed in battle. On the much longer end, we know that Yoda was over 900 years old, but we don't know what a non-force sensitive Yoda might look like. The typical lifespan for Yoda species could be much shorter, but they could also just all be force sensitive. We really don't know. There are other species like the Hutts who reach similarly long lifespans regardless of whether they're force sensitive. One Hutt, Bloatus, even served as Supreme Chancellor of the Republic for a period of 275 years, much longer than most of the Republic's citizens could ever hope to live, and that would likely have been only a fraction of his lifespan. Wookiees are another species who, while not quite as long-lived as Hutts or Yodas, do live to be up to about 400 years old. Chewbacca himself was over 200 by the time of the Empire, probably contributing to his memory issues when it came to ever mentioning anything about the Jedi to Luke, given that he was such a close friend of Yoda. There are several other species which come in between Wookiees and what we'd typically expect from a human lifespan, and usually the trick to having a long lifespan in Star Wars is to look kinda weird while also not being a bug. For example, another long-lived species were the Selegians, basically floating brains who could live nearly 300 years. There's a lot of info on species lifespan in specific media when they get mentioned, but the best and most consolidated place to get this kind of information is the Ultimate Alien Anthology, which has a section for almost every species giving different life stage age ranges, so it's a pretty neat source. The age ranges for these go from child up to venerable, and it's the same scale for every species, so it does kind of mash everything into the same developmental cycle, even though we know there are some species like the Rurians who have different, more specific versions of their life cycle. Rurians start out as larvae, which is when they are most intelligent and mostly considered sentient, but then when they become pupae and then their kind of mothy or butterfly-like stage, they actually stop being considered sentient, so it's a very different set of life stages than what you might get from a human. But the book doesn't give a similar table for humans themselves, so we don't really know how its presentation of each species might scale against what other places give for human lifespans in Star Wars. And human lifespans are their own messy bit of information and lore to some extent. Especially when it comes to the original trilogy's main characters, humans tend to age at the speed of plot, where by the time of Fate of the Jedi you have Han, Luke, and Leia approaching their 70s and 80s, but still adventuring like they were in their 20s and 30s. Although Luke and Leia being particularly powerful Force sensitives does help that make some more sense. When it comes to the even older but far less Force sensitive Han, even Lando, and Talon Karrde, things might get a little bit more questionable. Gilad Pellaeon is the quintessential old guy of Star Wars, and he managed to stay active as a military commander, albeit with a few attempts to retire, into his early 90s, when he finally liked this video and subscribed for more. But how standard is any of this? What would your experience be as someone just living in the Star Wars galaxy with no main character energy? There are a few places which attempt to deal directly with lifespans for humans in Star Wars. The first place to really seem to do it was intrusive Bakura, where Bakuran Senator Orn Belden is still active at 164, albeit with a replacement heart or two. And it was remarked that his wife Epi was strangely showing signs of senility at only 132. This turned out to have been the result of parasites rather than standard aging, and Luke was able to reverse the damage. These two are somewhat above the averages established for humans by later materials, but only just. The new Essential Guide to Alien Species puts the average human lifespan capping out around 120, with Force sensitives bringing that up to a possible 200, so it is somewhat lower than what a regular senator was doing in Intrusive Bakura. The Millennium Falcon novel by James Luceno backs up this information. There's a clinic in the book which focuses explicitly on research into aging, and they talk about how life extension research hasn't managed to get them to extend more than 25 to 75 years on the high end. I think there's also somewhere in the book which gives a more direct frame of reference on what that's an extension beyond, but I can't find it looking through it right now, and I didn't take a note of it if it exists when I was originally reading it, but assuming that like 90 to 100 was the baseline, then 125 to 175 does line up with the numbers from both the New Essential Guide and Truce of Bakura, though it does start treating the New Essential Guide version as more of a floor than a ceiling. Ironically, this means that Palpatine, who dies at about 86 in the original trilogy, then again multiple times at 92 or 93 years old in Dark Empire, and even in Rise of Skywalker, only about 112 to 113, despite all the effort that Palpatine put into trying to live forever, or at least you'd hope longer than regular people. This is just what happens when you're a villain trying to live forever. You barely make it past your universe's middle age. Well, this information seems to at least apply in practice to primary characters or characters who were introduced while already kind of old. A lot of secondary characters seem to die at what we would probably consider reasonable ages in real life, in the few cases where they die of natural causes, sometimes even a bit younger. Mon Mothma died at 72, shortly before the start of the Yuzan Vong War, although her health had been impacted severely by an Imperial bioweapon about a decade earlier. Akbar, while not a human, also died a bit younger than expected, partially because of how long he spent as a literal fish out of water. Sticking with rebel leaders, the Millennium Falcon novel implies that Garm Bel Iblis had died since his mentions in last novels, by mentioning that all the Republic group senators that a certain character had worked with were all dead at this point, although it's not an explicit mention that Garm had died. But we also don't know exactly what Garm's age was. He was about 60 when he was introduced, or at least in his 60s. He could have been older, as old as 70 or maybe even 80. And his final mentions are about 20 years later, so he probably made it to at least 100, maybe a bit older, but I wouldn't be surprised if Corellians had a predisposition to heart disease. Some works later in the Legends timeline started to really push the question of just how long main characters could live and be active. The final Legends novel, Crucible, was set in 44 ABY and had Luke, Han, and Leia still active, as well as some of their children and grandchildren. But once you get to the Legacy comics set under 100 years later, so around 130 to 137 ABY, nobody's still around, and none of them are even around in some of the flashbacks, which are probably about 40 years earlier, so 50 years after Crucible. So presumably a lot of them are dead, despite many of them coming in under the 120-year potential lifespan, especially for the Force sensitives. Jaina and Ben seem like they'd be likely candidates to still be hanging around. Same with Alana, who, to be fair, might have been still hanging around. Luke shows up as a Force ghost, but Sue Rastoni, former executive editor, says that may have just been a Force projection or a hallucination by a definitely very high Cade Skywalker, while Luke himself was busy elsewhere in the galaxy. And she spoke in another panel, which I'll link to in the description, about how these main characters could easily live up to 200 years anyways, so they could still have lots of adventures left in them after Crucible. And this was a time where the Legacy comics were still being published. We're also on our third generation of Force-sensitive Fel Emperors, so Jaina's grandson, by the time we get to the Legacy comics. I do think Luke, Jaina, and Ben being entirely absent during the Legacy series, and then turning out to actually be alive somewhere, would have been way more egregious than any number of Order 66 survivors turning up in various media, given their personal fame and their family connections to what was going on. But it kind of comes down to a problem that Star Wars could never really solve during the Legends period, trying to get newer characters from the books to stick and moving away from the original trio when necessary. I'm not really sure how they would have ultimately dealt with that if the novels had kept getting published leading up to the events covered in the Legacy comics, but frankly I think we may have been dealing with more butting heads between novel authors and the comic writers. Ultimately, it's a question they never ended up having to answer. That's going to do it for today's video though. Thank you for watching. Remember to leave a like and subscribe for more if you've enjoyed, and I hope to see you next time.